Okay, good. Yeah, it works. Yeah, I'm standing up because I'm used to standing up when I do a presentation. So thanks a lot for the two presenters that came before me. I learned a lot from that also. It's very good, very inspiring. So I'm glad to be here today. I'm one of the foreigners, having traveled all the way to Lannion. I've never been here, it's the first time. But it was a whole day of traveling. But it was pleasant nevertheless. It was comfortable in the train. Anyway, what I'm doing today is perhaps something more empirical in terms of I will just basically share with you some research findings from my own study, but also from other research that has been conducted specifically focusing on sports media. So my presentation will basically focus only on sports journalism. It's partly about representations of race and ethnicity in the sports media, but it's also about how the audiences, which includes you, which includes me, right? We are watching. You probably watched France win yesterday, and maybe you have, well, I'm not going to talk about my own country, but it's a real pity. But anyway, and I was actually looking all the channels yesterday in my hotel, but only France was on the screen and no Netherlands, yeah, of course. But partly my research is about football and soccer or football, but partly it's also about sports generally. So my presentation will consist basically of three parts, and it's firstly about representation. So how do these sport journalists, how do these football journalists, how do they speak about these different athletes who are very often in sports, who are of different racial and ethnic origins, right? And then I will also talk something a bit more about audiences and then about production. Although I must say that production is a research area that I think generally speaking has been under-researched, and this also includes my own research. Most research has been done on representations, on media content. Quite some scholars have focused on that. Audience reception is also under-researched, I would say, but still a bit more than the production side. So let's see. So what we're talking about is people like this. This is basically from the Netherlands. Those are all journalists, some ex-football players. And the interesting thing is that this is a football program, a soccer program. It's screened every Sunday night. And they are discussing the football clubs, but also they're analyzing the different players. And I think what's very interesting about football, about soccer, especially on television, is that it attracts so many people, right? It's so popular. So in the Netherlands, but this applies to many countries in Europe, but also worldwide, and I think also in France the same may apply. In the Netherlands, the football programs, especially when the national team plays, but also clubs, they are usually in the top 3 of most popular programs every week, right? And when there's a World Cup football, it's usually the top 5 is football. So it attracts massive audiences. It means that the journalists, those people, they can reach many people, young people, old people, across the population. So they have this kind of power to do that. But then in addition to that, it's a real platform for racial or ethnic diversity, right? So not so much sport journalism itself, because sport journalism itself in the Netherlands, as well as in many other countries, is mainly a white male profession. So it's kind of mainly white males who are basically in management, but also just in the commentary positions, right? Doing the journalism work. So in the journalism itself, it's mainly white and male, but the people that the football players or the athletes that they talk about, that they give meaning to, that they analyze, those football players or those athletes are very diverse. So I think it's the platform, like maybe the most visible platform in the media, where racial and ethnic diversity is basically portrayed, and where all kinds of stereotypes may also play a role, right? And I come to that. So that's very interesting about specifically football in the media, but also other sports are very diverse, obviously. But football in the media, especially because it's so very popular and because it shows these very different racial ethnic origins. And we're talking basically, and this is a gender bias as well in research, but also in parts about when I'm listening to myself now. This is about men's football, what we're talking about here, right? So this is something that that also is kind of a thing to kind of remember, that journalists don't talk so often about women's football. The researchers don't study women's football that often. Actually, the Dutch team, we were European champions recently in women's football, so maybe the journalists start reporting on that more from now onwards. But so we're talking about men's football and also very often about men's sport in research, although especially when it's about race, right? So we have many studies on gender in sport media coverage. We have many studies on that. But when it's about race and about representations of race, it's very often about representation of males who are black or white. Most studies also kind of define race in very specific terms. Many studies have been done in specific countries, very often US, England, especially the English language publications that I read are very often from these specific countries. And they very often define race in terms of black or white. So in a way that's a very dichotomous, very broad categorization. I think that can be criticized, and I've criticized it before in some other publications. But when you then take a further look at the findings, the specific results from these studies, you can see that most studies find that sport journalists, portray black athletes this is perhaps an illustration of this, portray black athletes as, let's say, hyper-physical, very fast, natural athletes, almost animal-like, instinctive athletes, right? So they are described in terms of their speed, their physical power, and also in terms of having this natural power. So it's not because they trained very hard, but it's because they are just natural athletes. And maybe journalists don't say this very literally, but it's the associations that they make with in this case with an animal, or it's sometimes also it's about repeating very often this message that black athletes are good, that black people are good athletes. If you repeat it and repeat it, it becomes in the end the common sense, right? And people don't question it anymore. But the same then would research shows us that the same applies to white athletes, but then they are more often associated with let's say leadership skills or strategical skills, which the previous presenter already referred to, right? So white athletes are more often seen as natural leaders, right? And as being the ones who can the ones who have perseverance, who work hard, right? It's mentality. They can also be strong physically, but that's not because they are naturally strong, but that's usually because they trained hard, etc. Right? So it's a different way. And there are definitely exceptions to this, right? Some sport journalists don't do this. But this is the general, when you put all the studies that have been done on this topic, when you put them together, then this is the general kind of image that you get from all these studies until today, right? So it's still very persistent. Some scholars have labeled this specific phenomenon enlightened racism, so they argue that this discourse about black and white athletes, and usually it's about black and white, right? There are other groups as well, obviously, that you can investigate, but usually those studies done in the US, UK, Australia, but also the Netherlands, some of them, they used black-white definitions. And this scholar argued that black success is framed in the media, in and through the media, as achievable and acceptable in sports, but not in other domains such as business, academics, or politics, right? Black athletes are associated with their body, with their physical capacities, and therefore they are kind of, framed only in that way. And white athletes more often in terms of their intellect, their perseverance, which is more important to achieve a social career, right? And this can have consequences. This can have consequences which go beyond sports and which go beyond sport career. For instance, this is just one example of my own research. So I did a few studies in recent years about leadership in football. So this means senior governance positions, but also coaching positions, management positions in professional football clubs, in men's football. I did this research for UEFA and also for some Dutch organizations, and it's very evident that when you look at the management positions, the leadership positions in sport clubs, in football clubs, it's white. They're mainly white people, right? It's the same in media, generally speaking. In sports media, it's also mainly white, especially when you go higher up the hierarchy, right? So coaches, managers also are mainly white in many countries, including the Netherlands. Actually, this research has been done in France. So we took 3 countries, France, England, and the Netherlands. And the image was kind of similar in all these countries. Higher up the hierarchy, it's all white. That's a bit, in a way, that contrasts with the pitch, with the playing field, where it's very diverse, right? So players are very diverse, but when you go higher up in the football levels, then you see only white people. And one of the things that, because I did interviews with coaches, with black coaches, with minority ethnic coaches, Moroccan, Dutch coaches in the Netherlands, Surinamese Dutch coaches, right? And they told me that one of the reasons why they had difficulties, because they did have the ambition to become a coach. So quite some of those persons who were a player in the past, they want to become a coach. However, they don't get there. It's only the white people who, in the end, get there. And they argued, they told me, I did interviews like 1 hour, 1.5 hour, 2 hour interviews, and they told me that there are different reasons for this, many different reasons. But one of the reasons, and that kind of comes back to the media aspect, one of the reasons was that club owners usually have an image of black players as being good athletes. But the image at the same time was that they cannot be good coaches, that they cannot be good leaders, that they are not really fit for those positions, right? So it shows that these stereotypes that are reproduced by the media also kind of have some similarities in football organizations and have real consequences at the same time. So for instance, one coach told me, this was a coach of minority ethnic background, told me, well, it will never be expressed explicitly, but there is a certain feeling, and he means here there's a certain feeling among club owners, he was talking about club owners, there's a feeling that minority ethnic people are less educated, and that their underrepresentation in coaching has to do with that. They can play football well, but they're not fit for certain positions or for policy making. They just don't see that, right? So it shows that these, let's say, these media discourses, they are not kind of innocent. They can have real consequences, strengthening and reproducing certain hierarchies. So that's basically what media representation research tells us, right? Then if we go to the audience, because that's also always a thing that to keep in mind. Okay, we can speak about the media and about how journalists give meaning to athletes, but yeah, what about the people who watch, right? How do they react to that? And so I did some recent studies. Well, a few actually, and this was one of them. How do audiences, media users who watch television, how do they negotiate or interpret these media football? It was about football here, men's football. It was about how do they negotiate discourses about race and ethnicity? And what we see here, so we did focus group interviews with people who were young and they watched football 1 hour a week. The focus groups were ethnically diverse, mainly males. This was done by a student of mine, but later on we published this as a chapter, right? So it was for his master thesis. And what comes out of this is that African football players were seen. So the people that he interviewed in these focus groups, they associated African football players with strength, with being naturally strong, being genetically advantaged to be good in sports, and especially football. And also, African football players were seen by most of the people that were interviewed as lacking tactical skills and lacking football intelligence, right? So it's kind of similar to what we've seen in the media coverage, right? So it's very similar in a way. So someone says, if someone is born in Africa and trained over there, they are often stronger and bigger. This is a combination of genetics and also hard work. So here the hard work theme is mentioned as well. Not only genetics, but it's a combination here. Another person says, while watching football, I can't help but notice that African players play less intelligent. I think this is mainly the result of training or the lack of tactical training, which is something that was repeated more often. There's another very important group in Dutch football, like that's basically the Surinamese players. So Suriname used to be a colony of the Netherlands long time ago, and when Suriname became independent, many people came to the Netherlands, and some football players, famous football players like Ruud Gullit, Seedorf, right? They are from Suriname. They are Surinamese Dutch football players, and they were seen. In those interviews, they were seen as naturally strong, also genetically advantaged, but they were also seen as having tactical skills, right? So it was a bit different than let's say how the African football players were seen. And the terms being used, like African, Surinamese, those terms were used by the interviewees themselves, right? They talked about the players in those ethnic terms, in those categorizations. So Suriname players were seen as physically strong, but also tactically skilled. For instance, this person says because Surinamese players are trained as professional football players over here. That means in the Netherlands. So it is noticeable that they master a lot more tactical and technical skills than Africans who are not trained here. In other words, once you're trained in the Netherlands, that's when you learn the tactical skills. But when you stay in Africa and football players are trained there, then this is not the case. And then those players are basically naturally strong only. And then there is an important group in the Netherlands, which is the Moroccan Dutch football players. This is quite an increasingly important group in Dutch professional football. And it's also a very interesting group because Moroccan Dutch young males in particular are very often seen in negative terms. It may be a group in terms of media coverage, which is similar perhaps in France to Algerian French people, perhaps. I think it may be similar. Moroccan Dutch young males in particular in the Netherlands are very often associated with criminality and terrorism, etc. But they're also important in football. They are increasingly visible. And they are seen as slim and short, as technically strong, but also aggressive, egocentric, and respondents very often associate them with street culture. So they say basically that the Moroccan Dutch players are technically strong because they play on the streets all day, right? They are aggressive and they're egocentric, etc. So it's another discourse, another meaning than for the black or African players. And this street culture association has similarities with let's say more like ghetto culture things, because some people did kind of mention that, make that association, like that they hang out on the streets all day and that it's only males doing that, etc. So one person says, when looking at the Dutch competition, a lot of Dutch Moroccan players are technical. It doesn't have to do with the Dutch football style, but with their physique, and a lot of them play football on the street. Maybe it's a bit of street culture. Okay, last, so I will just, yeah, this is the last from the last slide from this study, right? And basically what we see here has been replicated in more studies in the Netherlands. I've done more studies into this, and it's not very, very unique. These findings are not very unique. So Dutch white, so when people mentioned Dutch in the interviews, they usually meant white, right? So that's, and then they associated white football players, Dutch white football players, they associated them with hard working. They work hard. They are down to earth. They are intelligent. So the positive stereotypes are confirmed. The positive stereotypes that we know from studies that I've just shown you. So the media representation kind of squares with, reflects the discourses used by these people, by these young people. So it seems that they strengthen each other, right? The media strengthens these stereotypes, and these people then again use those stereotypes in their meaning making to football. And then one very, I think, very interesting question is, how can this all be traced back also to the production side of media? And at this specific moment, I'm writing a research proposal for a grant, and it's trying to connect all these different aspects. Like it's trying to connect, and it's mainly focusing on television. It's trying to connect the production side with the content, with the receptions. And the production side is interesting because what you see is that journalists, football journalists, sport journalists very often use so-called sincere fictions. That means, as it says here in very academic terms, personal mythologies that serve to sustain an internalized image of themselves as being objective, race neutral professionals. In other words, and I've had many debates with football journalists in the Netherlands on this topic, and they basically tell me, yeah, but we are just objective. We are neutral. We are journalists after all, right? So we have to be objective. And they also tell me, we don't use stereotypes. We just don't use it. Maybe my colleague does, but not me. But if everyone says that, it's kind of, because the research findings show that stereotypes are being used kind of persistently, right? So it seems as if sport journalists have this image of themselves as being very objective and neutral, but in the end, these stereotypes are being reproduced, maybe maybe unintentional, right? But still. And it also links with the concept of color blindness, which kind of color blindness means that you don't see color, or at least you say you don't see color. I don't see color. I don't care whether someone is black or white. I just focus on the individual qualities. But in the end, if stereotypes do exist, then something apparently is not so colorblind after all. So people may think of themselves to be colorblind. However, many of these stereotypes are so commonsensical that people aren't even aware of them anymore and use them. And this includes the football commentators. It probably includes myself as well, right? I'm not free of any bias myself, right? I'm more sensitive to the topic, obviously. I'm more aware of this, but I would say that these stereotypes are used by many of us. But however, football journalists have, of course, more impact, than I do. They reach massive audiences with their commentary practices. All right, so conclusion, preliminary, because the research of course continues. So racial stereotypes seem to be widespread in football media in many countries across Europe. And at the same time, little reflection seems to take place from the part of the football journalists, because they basically tell me, yeah, but we're just objective, and maybe your research tells me that there are stereotypes, but I just don't really believe it, because I'm just a neutral professional, okay? So yeah, so that's interesting to kind of reflect on a bit more in future research, so to speak. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacco van Sterkenburg, I succeeded to say it, for your presentation, which really echoes the presentation of Rejan Senak on the fact that people in the end might be given some natural traits and features. So there's the risk of essentialism, which is here. And it really focuses on the issue dealt here of of the coverage of media of sports in particular. So, nous avons largement dépassé le temps. J'espère que c'est gérable. Donc,